OverSoul 7 and the Museum of Time by Jane Roberts, read by Martin John. Chapter 8. Dr. Bainbridge is confronted with proof of the impossible. Or is he? Gregory Diggs found out that Dr. Bainbridge worked at the psych center only 2 mornings a week. So it was 2 days later that Gregory stood waiting in front of the dentist's office at the center's main building. He was nervous, he realized, no doubt about it. He suffered from a bad conscience, knowing that this was the man he'd intended to rob only a few days earlier. He still didn't know if he'd been in the right place or not, or if the odd character in old-fashioned clothes was a demented relative of this dentist or what. Gregory fidgeted. And who was the younger man who had finally let him go? For all of Gregory's desire to tell his story and prove John Window's abilities, he hadn't dared go back to Bainbridge's house. So now he waited impatiently as Dr. Bainbridge walked down the corridor, with 7 stepping smartly beside him. 7 and Gregory recognized each other at once. Gregory started to bolt, certain that the story of the attempted robbery must be out, but in a flash 7 grinned, put out his hand and said, "A patient who can't wait to get in, huh?" Confused, Gregory managed to smile half guiltily and half filled with gratitude. Dr. George Bainbridge said, "You aren't on my appointment list today, are you?" Bainbridge opened the door at the same time, and Gregory pushed in past 7. "I have to talk to you. Just a minute. You've got to see something." He was almost pleading, and his manner towards George was so deferential that George grinned quizzingly and said, with a half-laugh, "Not out to get me today." "I'm done with all that. Look at this," Gregory cried, opening his mouth as wide as he could. George shrugged, adjusted his glasses, started to say, "What happened? Lose a tooth?" When looking, he gasped and cried, "Jesus Christ, sit down there," and shoved Gregory over to the dental chair. "Open wider," he demanded. Gregory did. George let out a long whistle and said to 7, "Look in this kid's mouth, will you? Tell me what you see." Wonderingly, 7 looked. "All fine and dandy," he said. Super." And George Bainbridge, his face flushed, said, "That's what I was afraid you'd say." "Surprised, I bet," Gregory said. He laughed as George put his hand into his mouth and started tugging at his tight teeth. "Jesus," George said. "A few days ago these teeth were damn near ready to fall out. So bad, in fact, I figured the kindest thing to do for Greg here was let them just do that." He shook his head and looked at Gregory. "What happened?" he asked. "I've never in my entire career seen anything like this. Once started, the tissue gets more diseased, and in the condition you were in, the thing was way past any reversing. It just doesn't happen." "So you told me," Gregory said with relish. OverSoul 7 let his consciousness dip towards George's and found himself astounded at George's inner reaction. It was as if Gregory's healed gums had set off a series of psychological quakes in George's mind. He believed what he saw in Gregory's mouth, and yet he couldn't. He kept looking for ways of dismissing the evidence obviously before him. His stubborn denial completely baffled Seven. And Gregory, after laughing out loud triumphantly, found himself feeling sorry for the dentist. "What happened?" George demanded. He was red-faced. "You probably won't believe me," Gregory began. "After this, I'll believe anything," George muttered. Now when it actually came time to tell his story, Gregory found himself embarrassed. Only his determination to help the custodian kept him from running from the room. "I don't really know," he started. "My gums hurt like hell. I got 2 new gum boils from when I saw you. Then yesterday morning, I met this custodian in the entertainment room. He was sweeping up, and we talked." Gregory gulped and looked directly into George's eyes. His voice went high and scared and wavery. "This guy looked at me or did something, and suddenly I felt my teeth tighten in my head. I felt them tighten. I got hot all over and saw lights." He broke off, his telling of his story finally making him aware of its impact, of its impossibility, and of its definite truth. Briefly he lifted his head and cried, "It's that guy I told you about, the one who thinks he's Christ. He did it. He really did." OverSoul 7 tried to look impressed, but he kept his mouth shut so he wouldn't say the wrong thing. A body and a polyester suit didn't necessarily make you human, he thought, rather confused. And it certainly didn't make some human views any easier to understand. He wanted to shout, "Miracles, as you call them, happen all the time. That's nature unimpeded." But he said nothing of the sort. Instead, he tried to understand why George and Gregory Diggs both seemed so shocked, and why Gregory was almost near tears. George Bainbridge rubbed the corner of his nose, blew his nose, adjusted his glasses for the 10th time in 10 minutes, sat down, and threw out his nearly pudgy arms in astounded dismay. "Well, if it happened, it happened. No dentist could have fixed those gums in 10 years, much less 2 days. There's no way you could have tricked me," he said this last to Gregory, but with desperate question in his voice, as if wishing that he was being tricked. "Indeed," he said, "I'd almost rather it was a trick than face, well, what those healed gums imply." He took the cellophane off a fresh patient's glass, filled it with water, and drank it down quickly. Gregory just watched him. He was trying to recover his own composure. Then he said, almost apologetically, "That's not really all, but my whole body's felt terrific since. Fantastic. And well, I'm not so, paranoid about people." He looked embarrassed. With a sudden rush, of despairing humor, George said, "Well, every silver lining has a cloud." Gregory managed a wan grin and glanced toward Seven. "I've done some things I'm not proud of," he said, with a slight question in his own voice. Now that he'd told his story, he began worrying that Seven might tell Bainbridge about the attempted robbery. But Seven gave Gregory a brilliant grin and said, "Put all that behind you." Seven had been so quiet that George almost forgot he was there. Rather startled, brought back from his own thoughts, he said emphatically, Right. Then, after a pause, he shook his head again with new perplexity. "Had to be suggestion. It's the only answer. I mean, that guy John Window is a nut. At least he certainly isn't Christ. But suggestion? Shit. How can suggestion heal gums in a minute that we're in the shape yours were in? I can't." With more courage than he knew he had, Gregory said, "That guy may not be Christ, but he's okay. I mean, he knows that he thinks he's Christ sometimes. And he's harmless. But not only that, man. Think of how many people he could cure. Maybe he could even cure cancer. Super! A whisk of the hand and you're cured." George planked his hands on his hips. "I can't quite see that," he said, almost vehemently. Then, with true exasperation, "Open your mouth again, will you? And Seven, get me this kid's dental records from the file there. I want to see that diagnosis in black and white." Seven got out the records. George flipped through them, holding up Gregory's with the tip of his fingers, as if it were made of fire. He eyed it gingerly, unbelievingly. He shook his head again and said, "Well, there you are. Dated 4 days ago. Advanced periodontal disease." Looking at the record, his worst fears confirmed that something impossible had happened. George determined to face the impossible with determination, vigor, and a sense of humor. His pragmatism made him face the fact of a most unusual event. That's what it amounted to, he decided, just as Gregory asked, in a worried tone, "What are you going to do?" "Do?" George repeated. "Hell, what's to do? It's done. I might like a little talk with that custodian, though. Or then again, maybe not. Give me a bit of time to think about it. I'd like to see those gums of yours tomorrow, anyhow." "You won't get Window in trouble, will you?" Gregory asked, sounding more worried than before. "I mean, well, his abilities challenge the authorities, don't they?" "They sure as hell do," George answered. He was caught because, though he was normally a member of the establishment, his sympathies were usually with the underdog, which was one of the reasons he helped out at the center to begin with. But his conventional knowledge of medicine and dentistry made him scandalized at the apparent healing. It flew in the face of all common sense knowledge. Moreover, he was beginning to remember his own encounter with the Christ patient. This made him more nervous than before. "Look, I've got 3 patients lined up for this morning, he said. I'll think about this, and I'll get in touch with you. We'll put this thing in some kind of perspective. Gregory didn't want to budge, but Seven gave him a friendly shove and led him to the door. I'll be in touch, I promise, George assured him. After Gregory left, George did 2 extractions and a filling without saying another word to Seven except for, "Just hand me that thingamajig," pointing to an instrument for which Seven had learned the proper name, but not George's pet designation. So Seven was kept hoping, anticipating what George would want next, and following the gesture of George's arm as his fingers pointed generally to the area in which the instrument could be found. "Now, the digger," he said, and when Seven promptly handed him the tool, he murmured, "Super," but in a distracted, automatic way. Even his reminders to the patients to open wider were made without his usual accompanying smile. When the last patient left, George looked at Seven and shook his head. "I am truly mystified. For the first time in my life, I just do not know how to react. What's your opinion of all this?" This time Seven forgot himself in his desire to help, so he said, "What's the problem? The boy's gums were definitely healed. Miracles are nature, unimpeded." George's eyes snapped open. "That's an odd thing to say. Miracles are nature unimpeded? Huh? Bullshit. Something's going on besides just the healing of gums. Come on now. You don't think we've been hypnotized?" "Hypnotized?" Seven asked, astounded. Where could George ever get an idea like that? "Or maybe we're hallucinating," George went on lamely. "Nope. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm hooked. I've got to find out what happened. Some kind of gimmick's got to be involved." As they talked, George and Seven locked the office and left the building and headed for the parking lot. The June afternoon was warm. The day a soft green gray. Every time he visited the center, George passed the playground. But this afternoon, talking with Seven, he paused and sat down on a swing. Seven sat on the swing beside him. There were no children around this time of day, and only a few patients strolled the grounds. The sounds of traffic from the nearby main street were partially muted by all the shrubbery, and Seven and George sat, not speaking for a moment. Then George said, "You're an odd one, you know. You're taking all this damn calmly." "What is, Seven said lightly. "Maybe it's because you're younger. I don't know. But at least when I went to dental school, they taught us that some things were absolutely irreversible, certain conditions. Hell, I'm chairman of the cancer drive." "The drive for cancer?" Seven said incredulously. "Who wants that?" "It's no time for jokes," George replied. "If one cure like that can happen, it shifts the entire medical profession. Instead of drives for dollars for technological advances, we'll have to, hell, I don't know, examine our ideas about the entire body, or find healers for Christ's sake, or, well, you know where one healer is, Seven said innocently. Yeah, in a nut house, where I'd say he belonged. If I hadn't seen that kid's gums for myself. Suddenly George sat bolt upright. I've got it, he shouted. There are 2 kids. Yes, that's it. They're twins. One with good gums, and the one with lousy ones. It's a goddamn con game. Twins? He gasped, laughing so heartily that he was half bent over, sitting in the swing. Seven just stared. Oh, Christ, how could I have fallen for that? George shouted between laughs. That little bugger's out to get me just because I couldn't fix his damn gums. I mean, he thinks we're all shitheads, members of the establishment, and that we couldn't care less. We get paid somehow. As hard as he tried, OverSoul 7 couldn't understand George's reaction. Why would George prefer that fraud was involved in the first place? And why was George growing more jovial by the minute? Finally, Seven said, You don't think there was any miracle at all, then? Hell no. You're too gullible and well-meaning, George said, still laughing, but more softly. He swung back and forth gently, studying the toe of his right shoe, as if the answers were contained within it. Look, he said, that Christ chap had to be in on this, too. Twin 1 shows me his lousy gums. Then Twin 2 shows me his healthy ones, and says that Christ healed him. But where do they expect to go with it from here? Miracles? Boy, I was ever taken in. I don't suppose you believe in the soul either, huh? Seven asked, a trifle plaintively. George stood up to stretch his legs. I believe in teeth and gums, he said, grinning, and they don't lie. Within the context of the relationship between himself and George, Seven could only say so much. And he didn't even know how to say that. He thought miserably, but he looked at George with just the slightest touch of severity and replied, There's more to life than teeth and gums, though. And at once he saw that he'd hurt George's feelings, because George sat back down on the swing, slapped Seven lightly but disapprovingly on the shoulder and said, Yeah, well, listen, being a dentist may not be the most heroic profession in the world, as you'll find out yourself before too long. But I'll tell you one thing. People are damn grateful when a bad tooth is extracted, or you get rid of the pain, and that's real. It may not be philosophic, but it's a very practical help to people when they're suffering. So I leave the question of souls to the ministers or priests or whatever. And I still say that gums are honest. They don't lie. And Seven just stared. He was learning more about George every minute. George grinned and said, You surprised? Anyhow, that's why a con game like that makes me mad. Giving people false hopes. Though, hell, I can understand the motives involved. I'll just play along to see what they plan next before I lower the boom. You'll have to find Gregory's twin first, Seven said. and I was thinking how great it was that the kid's attitude had changed so for the better. Miracle or no, said George, starting to laugh again. Instead, 2 kids. Well, the joke's on me, I guess. But then, suddenly George's mood changed. He dug his foot into the sand beneath the swings and said, in a harder voice, except that it's not such a funny joke, when you come right down to it. Hell, I don't know. But I worked on that custodian's teeth the other day. He told me it was Christ, all right. He seemed like a nice enough guy. When I finished, he said, God bless you, or something like that. George broke off, obviously embarrassed. Seven said, and? Shit, George went on, grinning self-depreciatingly. But for just a few moments there, I felt great, renewed, vigorous, full of life, or whatever. The attendant said that kind of thing happened now and then, and laid it to suggestion. And it had to be suggestion. But God damn it, I'm not particularly suggestible. Or I didn't think I was. Momentarily, George seemed to forget that Seven was even there. He mused, aloud, but to himself, I thought of all kinds of things that I haven't thought about in years. And now this. It's a dirty shame when people take advantage like that. Like what? Seven asked, unable to remain quiet. Like, well, hell, raise false hope like that, George cried, throwing up his arms in the air. Well, let's get going, he said. Life's no playground, and I'll tell you that. I'm going to catch that bunch red-handed. Resolutely, George got up and began striding toward the parking lot. Beside him, feeling some alarm, OverSoul 7 almost shouted, You might be in for more surprises than you're counting on. But George didn't answer. He was filled with righteous indignation. His brown eyes blazed. His arms swung vigorously at his sides. A joke is a joke, and enough is enough, he said. And Seven thought that George suddenly bore an uncomfortable resemblance to his grandfather, George Bainbridge I. In Chapter 8, Peace, Light, and Love. Aloha.